met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
I'm Kim Belair. I'm a writer, I'm a narrative designer, I'm extremely nervous, and I'm the co-founder of a little narrative development company called Sweet Baby Inc. We do narrative development in games and kind of beyond, and we try to bring a lot of inclusion, diversity, and new ideas kind of to the industry.
Gives us the right to say what we want.
Shut
when you think about it.
Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm Saladino. Okay, so this is that infamous GDC talk Kim Belair gave back in 2019.
If you're a creative working in AAA, which I did for many, many years, put this stuff up to your higher-ups, and if they don't see the value in what you're asking for when you ask for consultants, when you ask for research, go have a coffee with your marketing team and just terrify them with the possibility of what's going to happen if they don't give you what you want.
Now, I've done a video already on this talk a few months back. But then I only got as far as the first 6 minutes or so. So I guess you could call that video part 1. And this is part 2. I had a lot to say about Belair's supervillain origin story in that first video, where she claimed that ever since she was a little girl, or I guess in her case, ever since she was a female identifying youngling, she wrote and drew stories, and she put herself and everyone she knew in them, and all of her friends and family encouraged her, and so on. But then, when she went to high school, she learned that only straight white men were allowed to produce real art. It was an absurd claim, and what Kim was really doing was just demonizing the high school reading list with feminist ideology about marginalized people. As I was saying in that video, if Kim was really passionate about writing, she would have been an avid reader and would have come across all sorts of writers that they didn't teach her in high school. She would have already learned about a lot of these black women writers, at least like Toni Morrison and Ursula K. Le Guin. Ursula K. Le Guin isn't a black women writer, but, women writers, queer writers. She would have learned about some of them at least by the time she got to high school. But the thing about Belair is, and this is true across the board, I think, with a lot of these woke activists that have invaded geek spaces, they're seeking validation for their own mediocrity, and they're using a political agenda to try and give their work depth. But it doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way. So the name of this TED Talk or whatever is Now You See Me. Representation as innovation. I don't want to see you. I don't care. This is the fundamental issue with activists who've invaded comics and video games and geek hobbies. This narcissism. They don't come to these places to lose themselves. They come to them for self-aggrandizement.
I'm making art now because I can look at the stories that are being told, that are being held up as legitimate and as classic, and they look like the stories that I'm telling.
Making art. That's the thing. You can be creative. Anyone could be creative. But making art requires something deeper and more genuine than turning everyone into black Vikings or defeating the male gaze or obsession with gender ideology. These things are not art. And say that they were art or some kind of element of art. So you want to accept this BS mantra that cancel pigs like to spew out that all art is political. Fine. Let's humor that. Let's go with that. That isn't what AAA games require. These are male hobbies you're invading. We know what we want when we come to it. Sometimes, a lot of times, especially in the AAA space, we just want pure escapist fun. It doesn't always have to have the hottest, sexiest women in them, but we don't want these DEI monstrosities either. You can't go into a stranger's house, smear shit all over the walls, and call it the creation of Adam.
And for so many years I did this that I think it was probably only in my early to mid 20s that I started to realize that I had internalized this like deeply, deeply uninteresting idea that in terms of narratives and stories, white and male are, neutral and universal.
In a way they are. Young Ripper made this point. Straight white male characters are the only characters in fiction that don't get to fall back on their identity. They have to actually be interesting and compelling characters. They have to have good stories. They don't get to just exist as an identity so that a bunch of psychos on Twitter can defend them from any type of criticism.
And I say that even as a woman of color, so while we don't all fall into that trap, I say it to kind of illustrate how easy it is, I think, for us to kind of take on that narrative even as people who are marginalized, even as we're fighting.
Fighting what? She's talking like race-swapping Saga Anderson and Alan Woke 2 as some kind of political action. I mean, yeah, it is, but she's not out in the streets staring down government shock troops or whatever.
Because we've kind of created this normal that we all unconsciously follow, and it affects us even as we advocate for change. There are things and times, like back in the day, if you'd asked me, oh, are you doing this on purpose? Are you only telling stories that fit the dominant narrative? I would never have said yes. But I think that a lot of people end up doing it even as they're saying we have to do better. And I think that that's actually shown in the way that we manage representation, which we still consider it this like deviation from something that is normal. And representation is this like very, very scary and very uncertain thing. And if we do it wrong, or if we don't do it, accurately, or if we kind of take a risk, we might get shouted down, and that fear is enough to stop us. And I think like that sucks.
I hate the way she says, that sucks. She's probably just saying it that way because it pops up on the monitor and she's trying to emphasize it. But because she's a feminist and I can't help roasting her, I just picture her as she says the word sucks. She realizes she said sucks. And now she's picturing some straight white man in the audience, imagining her giving them a blowjob or something. So this thing about we've created this normal that we all unconsciously follow, that's more feminist bullshit. If you want ugly black women in games, make your own damn games. I keep saying this. Men's hobbies are not platforms for women or feminism. This is why it's called activism. The fact that they keep injecting this stuff into our hobbies. Belair is acting like there's a societal problem with men having hobbies because Miranda Lawson has a nice ass. If she doesn't like sexy characters, that's her problem. Plenty of people love this stuff just as it is. Well-worn tropes, cliches and all. Yes, there is always room for innovation, but not because feminists don't like straight white men. Representation is not a thing. Not to the extent in the way that they frame it.
And it's such a bummer because it's the only way sometimes that we end up talking about it. We end up saying, we're going to share our stories of microaggressions, which I am going to do today, but we share stories of trauma and of doubt. And when we're dealing with narratives in advocacy, we end up going like, okay, these stories are stirring and they're beautiful, but they're also very sad and very heartbreaking. And I think it's important to do that. It's important to share like all of those painful stories.
All of this stuff sounds like things being taught in liberal art colleges. People go to hobbies. They go to video games to be entertained. You can always learn something or have novel experiences, but it's not Kim Belair's job to shove her feminist ideology down the throats of people who are just looking to shoot things and blow things up and admire jiggle physics. This is the ultimate, ma'am, this is a Wendy's. She's over here talking about advocacy when the actual customer base is checking YouTube for the best bleed builds in Elden Ring. Again, if you want to share stories about your own political hangups and personal issues about microaggressions, make your own games. Stop putting this in Spider-Man and Tomb Raider. Lara Croft doesn't look like a man. MJ doesn't have a flat ass and broad shoulders and dress like goddamn Arthur with a jaw that can cut diamonds.
if we're going to actually understand the struggle and convey the struggle. But I think today I'd like to take a moment and kind of assume the best, because I want to assume that all of you are here in this advocacy talk because what I've said so far is already familiar, already painful, and I want to kind of assume that you have sat with that, or if it's not your experience, you've already sat and listened to that in other areas. And rather, I think, than spending the next 15 or so minutes kind of sitting in that pain, I want to share some examples from my own experience and then kind of discuss how we can do better and find different and more interesting ways of talking about this stuff as creatives and as advocates and as people who overall want practical solutions to these kinds of problems.
Sitting in that pain. See, this is a woman thing. Women talk like this. I mean, can you picture a bunch of frat boy debs in the 90s or early 2000s, and they're in some beach house somewhere talking about the first person shooter they're working on where you're going to be killing demons flying around with their heads on fire, and they're talking about sitting with trauma and pain? She sounds like everybody's in a therapy session at this talk. You have broken people, or people who are selling the idea of broken people, invading a hobby where most people just want to kill demons and save or fight alongside chicks with big boobs and nice asses. This is something that women don't think about or don't care about, especially these women who love to co-opt the language of therapy to push their agenda. They don't care that playing violent video games with sexy protagonists is a form of therapy. Escapist entertainment is how a lot of us deal with trauma and pain, how a lot of men deal with this trauma and pain.
So let's talk about video games. To begin, a lot of the work that I do is in narrative consultation and narrative design. And one of the things that I offer as part of, my list of services is risk assessment and sensitivity reading. And so recently I was consulting on a project that was a dating simulator.
I wonder what this dating simulator game is. I know it wasn't that terrible game, Validate. Although Validate is probably the result of this TED Talk. In risk assessment. What risk? All that means is someone's going to be offended. But you're never going to please all of the people any of the time. As a game studio, you should be focused on your potential customer base. If anyone has a problem with that, then they're not your base. I get not wanting to be out and out offensive. But feminists have created an environment online where everything is offensive. A sexy woman is offensive. All white Vikings are offensive. These people can't be reasoned with, and you risk so much more than angry tweets when you let Sweet Baby Inc. work on your games.
And I was faced with a very simple decision point that the writers were trying to achieve, and it was this interaction between the female identified date and you, the protagonist, and you could customize your gender, you could customize your appearance and everything.
Female identified date. Normal people don't talk like this. One of the reasons why this gender ideology is just gibberish is the way in which none of the people who push for this stuff can keep it straight. I thought the difference between woman and female was biological and social. What does female identified mean if females are biological? So, not only can you identify as a woman or man, but you can also identify as female or male? Makes no sense.
So the love interest is on a date with you, and they ask you a very simple question, and it's, what was your ex like? Which is a bit much for a first date, but the player can either choose to say, okay, my ex was a good person, but it didn't work out. They can choose to say, I don't know if I really want to talk about that, or they can choose to say, my ex was a monster. And choosing my ex was a monster, the woman on the date with you goes like, yikes. You must be so immature if that's what you're going to say on a date about your ex. You must be not over this, you must be figuring something out. And I think that you lose favor in that moment with that character. And I can see where the design was. I understand that.
Yeah, nah, I don't believe this story. I'm pressing X to doubt. You get 3 choices. If you say your ex was a monster, I don't understand why the developers would have your date attack you for it right off the bat. The sensible thing would be for them to ask for more details. Now, look, maybe the writers were really this stupid that they wouldn't take the time to add more dialogue between you and the date. Allowing for you to decide how you want to characterize your ex. I don't know, it just doesn't sound right though. I don't believe that they would do something like this.
what they wanted to do was just have a very simple question where if you respond, your or your date can say, I like that, or I don't like that, or kind of be neutral about it. But I played through that and I realized something that they hadn't really seen, and it's that this question was deeply gendered, despite the fact that they didn't even intend that. When we treat, I guess, cis, hetero, male characters as the default, we end up like questions like this. And I say that because while it's a generalization, when we have those characters and they say something like, hey, my ex is a monster, what we're being asked to assume is that that person has a crazy ex-girlfriend. We're being asked to assume that they're being immature or they might have, a real harpy at home. It's almost like a laugh line a lot of the time.
One of the problems with gender ideology is that Kim has to tell this story as if there's something wrong with gender norms. Just because you think life is a liberal arts class doesn't mean the rest of the world does or should. If the devs allowed you to customize the type of player you could be, along with your gender, but couldn't account for gender-specific issues like what the responses would be coming from a man or a woman, then I don't even see the point of making a dating sim in the first place. It's not like all of your dev time and resources are going into big action set pieces or anything. Like, the dialogue choices should be the main thing, and that should be where your efforts would go into, not just, okay, here's just something we toss off and then move on to the next.
So I asked, hey, what if I'm playing as a woman? Because what I had to explain very delicately was that if I'm playing as a woman and I'm assuming that I'm interacting with a woman and we don't know about my ex, there's an upsettingly high likelihood that when I say to another woman, my ex was a monster, what I'm referring to was an abusive situation rather than just an immature joke.
But this is what I'm saying. It's a dating sim. You're playing as either a man or a woman, along with these other fake genders. But realistically speaking, if you were on a date as a man and you said your ex was a monster, it's likely that you're talking about a crazy ex-girlfriend. And even though that's a thing, that's a real thing, feminists have turned it into misogyny because an overly emotional woman who does crazy things for validation and control is actually a victim of the patriarchy, and it's the man's fault she's acting that way. And if you're playing as a woman and you say, my ex was a monster, you're talking about an abuser, plain and simple.
And so I actually said, you know what, though? Don't worry about it. We can create a condition for this, because if you respond to that person by saying, hey, my ex was a monster, what if she digs a little deeper? What if she checks and says, hey, is that a pain point for you? Or says like, oh, is that something touchy for you? Or maybe says like, do you mean that as a flippant remark?
Even without Sweet Baby Inc. being involved, I don't see how the devs would have your date respond in the same negative way, no matter what sex or gender you chose. It's common sense that you would take that into account and have the player answer a set of deeper questions in an attempt to challenge them into not fucking the date up.
Common sense. Simple common sense.
That would seem to be the entire point of the game, right? As a dating sim, so that would be the gameplay loop. Dialogue and questions and more choices.
Because I think that even though, this game is light, it would be a genuinely important moment to be able to express that sentiment in a game. And when I suggested that, the writing team was like, okay, thank you for this insight. And then they just took it away. They got nervous, and I think that is the problem that we face when we think of representation as a challenge that we just need to surmount. We could just go, nope, solved, we did it, because we took it away and we don't have to face it anymore. But I thought here, this was an opportunity for innovation. Here we had the chance to make a woman who has been victimized see herself in a game, be able to express something to another woman in a game, and kind of actually relate to it. And
sure, having two women on a date talking shit about men is innovation.
Sure, well, come on then. Okay, sure. Now, sure, one now. Yeah, sure.
I don't know, it's just comical thinking of some abused woman seeing herself as some dumb dating sim. Activists trivialize real issues by pretending hobbies like gaming, comics, and what have you have to portray them in order to allow people to see themselves. Wow, this game character had an abusive ex too. I feel so seen. So stupid.
We had that opportunity, but instead we pulled back because we thought it was safer not to push forward. And after the whole thing was done, the team thanked me again, and they said, like, thanks so much, you really mitigated the risk. And I think that the way that we talk about this kind of thing is itself a problem. We need sensitivity readers. We need risk assessment. And these are, like, again, important services that I literally, like, list on every PDF that I send out to be like, hey, I can do risk assessment and sensitivity reading. But I think when we do that kind of work and we make it seem like what we're doing is, you know, being very careful, being very scared, we end up just kind of sanding down all the rough edges instead of building something new and building something out. And that means that we feel daunted when we discuss representation because we talk a lot about representation as the mitigation of pain, but we don't talk about representation as a creator of joy.
Like I said, the risk assessment is just about being worried that you'll get canceled on Twitter. In this whole mitigating pain thing, it's not pain. Being offended is not pain. In fact, people get life out of being offended. People seek being offended, especially people like this. This trigger warning bullshit is just people victimizing themselves in order to control what other people say or do. And as sensitivity readers, they do sand down the rough edges in art and entertainment. That's literally the point of their existence. They do it intentionally, not because they're worried about other people being offended or other people having pain. They do it because they get offended. For her, when she talks about, oh, as sensitivity readers, we have to be careful about sanding down the rough edges like that's a bad thing. But from her point of view, it's bad because the rough edges are things like two women shit-talking their bad ex-boyfriends. That's what makes the game worthwhile to her. That's what should stand out to her. It's just feminist agenda instead of art or entertainment. So from here, Belair starts to get into the representation as joy part of her talk, which is really silly. Almost to the point of being infantile. But I think I'll take a look at that some other time.